What's up, everyone? My name is Alex, and welcome back to another close reread of the A Song of Ice and Fire novels by George R.R. Martin. It has been a while since I've done one of these videos, so without further ado, let's dive right into Eddard I of A Game of Thrones. Now, I have to be honest, Ned Stark is not one of my favorite characters of the series. He's not my least favorite character. He's just not a character that I particularly connected with when I first watched the show and then when I read the books. But I was really excited to get into his character with this reread because George does something with Ned that I think is really super interesting. So George lets us into Ned's POV when he is one of the only characters who knows the truth about possibly one of the biggest secrets in the entire series. Ned is the only character so far who knows the truth about who Jon Snow is. Now, of course, this secret has not been revealed in any of the books that have been published in the series so far. But there are so many hints, especially in Ned's chapters, as to what's actually going on, what actually happened in the past with Lyanna and Rhaegar, and who Jon Snow is. And Ned's first chapter is full of those hints too. So Ned 1 is the follow-up chapter to Catelyn 1. In Catelyn 1, we learn that Robert Baratheon, King of the Seven Kingdoms, is coming north to Winterfell, and Ned 1 starts off with everybody arriving. Since this is the first chapter where we're meeting many of the main characters of the series, there are a lot of descriptions of people, but something that I found interesting in the first page of Ned 1 is the way that he describes Jaime Lannister, Tyrion Lannister, and Sandor Clegane. Ned knew many of the writers. There came Sir Jaime Lannister with hair as bright as beaten gold, and there Sandor Clegane with his terrible burned face. The tall boy beside him could only be the crown prince, and that stunted little man behind them was surely the imp, Tyrion Lannister. Now with Sandor and Tyrion, their biggest identifiers are physical. Tyrion has dwarfism, and Sandor has half of his face burned. But with Jaime Lannister, I would argue that his biggest identifier is the fact that he's the Kingslayer. Now in Daenerys' first chapter, which is the chapter directly before this one, we hear the phrase Kingslayer for the first time. This guy who was supposed to be their father's protector had actually killed him during the rebellion. But we don't learn who this character was, we just know that he was a Lannister. We don't know if it was Jaime or Tyrion or Tywin or some other unidentified Lannister, we just know that that was the house that the person was from. And I think it's really interesting in this first part of Ned's chapter that he identifies Jaime by his hair and not by the fact that he's the Kingslayer, especially since Ned really judges Jaime for that. Ned is one of those characters who we learn has a very strong sense of honor, and so that constantly puts him at odds with Jaime because Jaime broke his vow in the Kingsguard. So I'm not entirely sure why George made that particular choice of description for Jaime. If he was just like wanting to tell the audience what everyone looked like, or if he was, specifically saving that piece of information that Jaime Lannister is the Kingslayer for later on in the story. But I just find it interesting. So George goes on to describe Robert Baratheon. Robert leaps off of his horse and goes to greet Ned and gives him this big ol' hug. And Ned scarcely recognizes him because Robert has just gotten so fat, and he's got these big dark circles under his eyes. He looks like shit. But before George gets into the description of what Robert looks like, he mentions the last time that Ned had seen Robert. 15 years passed when they had ridden forth to win a throne. The Lord of Storm's End had been clean-shaven, clear-eyed, and muscled like a maiden's fantasy. Now, I won't get into the whole muscled like a maiden's fantasy. There have been plenty of metas written about that particular phrase, and I'm sure lots of fan fiction as well. But the thing that I find interesting about this sentence is how Ned describes the rebellion. 15 years passed when they had ridden forth to win a throne. That phrase right there, I think, is really fucking important to the motivations behind the entire rebellion. So of course the rebellion had started because Rhaegar rode off with Lyanna Stark. She was allegedly kidnapped. And then when Brandon Stark, Ned's oldest brother, went south to challenge Rhaegar and get Lyanna back, Rhaegar and Lyanna obviously weren't in King's Landing. Aerys takes Brandon hostage. Their father comes south, and both of them are killed. So that sparks the whole thing, right? But it wasn't about just those things for them. It was about taking control of the Seven Kingdoms. And I think that's something that a lot of people overlook. Like, they don't think about, oh, they could have gone another route. They could have not killed Rhaegar's wife and children. After Aerys died, they could have installed Rhaegar's eldest son as, king, or even Viserys, because Aerys had named him his heir after Rhaegar died. They could have left the Targaryens in peace. But no, they wanted complete extermination of all of the Targaryens. And yet, they're the heroes. Like, even Ned's friendship with Robert, I think, is a lot more problematic than most people want to see it as. Like, as Ned is thinking about what Robert used to look like in the past, he notes, in those days, the smell of leather and blood clung to him like perfume. This is Ned's best friend, and he's remembering that Robert frequently smelled like leather and blood. So he did a lot of fighting and a lot of killing. And yet Ned is his friend regardless. But according to the fandom and, most of the people in A Song of Ice and Fire, Ned is still, put on this pedestal as one of the most honorable characters in the entire series. But Ned is a lot more flawed and a lot more nuanced than that. He is not just goody two-shoes, always does the right thing in order to protect people. Like, he does what he believes is necessary. And I think that is one of those things about his character that frequently just gets left out. Like, in the next paragraph, when Ned is thinking back to the last time that he had seen Robert, it was during Balon Greyjoy's rebellion, when the Stag and the Direwolf had joined to end the pretensions of the self-proclaimed King of the Iron Islands. Since the night they stood side by side in Greyjoy's fallen stronghold, where Robert had accepted the rebel lord's surrender, and Ned had taken his son Theon as hostage and ward, the king had gained at least 8 stone. So yes, this paragraph is more a description of Robert and how much weight he's gained since the last time Ned saw him, which was 9 years ago. But it's also telling the reader about this other rebellion, the Greyjoy Rebellion, where Ned ended up taking Theon as hostage and ward. Like, Ned didn't take Theon on as his ward in order to be a nice guy, or, in order to form a better relationship between the Iron Islands and the North. It was to ensure that Balon Greyjoy stayed under the thumb of the Seven Kingdoms and that he wouldn't rebel again. Because if he did, Ned's got his son. Now, some people could argue, oh, maybe Ned took Theon as his ward so that if Balon Greyjoy did rebel again, Theon wouldn't die, because maybe Ned would have more mercy and wouldn't kill him. And if he were in the South in King's Landing with Robert and, all of the Lannisters and stuff, he most certainly would die. But at the same time, Theon is still a hostage. Like, that part is inarguable. And that's what, ends up leading into Theon's whole storyline in A Clash of Kings. Like, even if he's treated gently with the Starks, and even if Ned possibly wouldn't have killed him if his father did rebel again, that's gotta be super damaging to Theon's psyche. So for all the meta in the fandom, and for all of the characters in A Song of Ice and Fire who put Ned on this pedestal as being one of the most honorable men in the Seven Kingdoms, his actions still have consequences, and I think that's really important. So Cersei and her children arrive, and everybody's greeting everybody else, and then Robert turns to Ned. "Take me down to your crypt, Eddard. I would pay my respects." Ned loved him for that, for remembering her still after all these years. When it comes to Robert, Ned just seems to be voluntarily blind to who his best friend actually is. Like, he knows before Robert was betrothed to Lyanna that he was screwing around, that he had a child with some other woman, and that he wasn't that great of a person. He knew that Lyanna was not in love with Robert, and yet Ned is still romanticizing this fact that Robert still romanticizes Lyanna's memory. But again, it's one of Ned's biggest flaws, and one of those things that makes him more nuanced as a character, rather than just the very flat facade of the honorable Eddard Stark that a lot of people still associate him with. So when Robert asks to be taken to the crypt so that he can visit Lyanna, we have this really interesting line. "The Queen had begun to protest. They had been riding since dawn. Everyone was tired and cold. Surely they should refresh themselves first. The dead would wait." One of George's infamous one-liners there, foreshadowing what's to come, because the dead certainly are not waiting. So Ned and Robert start making their way down to the crypts. Ned asks Robert how their journey was, and Robert starts to complain about the terrain and the lack of decent inns in the north, and we have this really interesting exchange. "I've never seen such a vast emptiness. Where are all your people?" "Likely they were too shy to come out," Ned jested. He could feel the chill coming up the stairs, a cold breath from deep within the earth. "Kings are a rare sight in the north." Robert snorted. "More likely they were hiding under the snow." "Snow, Ned." So this exchange is really simple, but the way that George orders the dialogue entirely changes the way that this passage can be interpreted. So Robert asks Ned where are all the people, and Ned jokes that they're too shy to come out because kings are a rare sight in the north. And when Robert replies that more likely they were hiding under the snow, Robert's referring to the people hiding under the snow. But because the sentence directly before Robert's line is "kings are a rare sight in the north," it sounds like Robert's referring to kings hiding under the snow rather than the people. And the word snow is even italicized in the text. They're going down to visit Lyanna Stark's grave. Lyanna was kidnapped by Rhaegar Targaryen, who was heir to the Iron Throne. They had a son together. His name is Jon Snow. There's a king under the snow. That line could be more foreshadowing, or it could just be another coincidence, but I think it's fun. Robert then starts to wonder what the North will be like once winter comes. "The others take your mild snows," Robert swore. "What will this place be like in winter? I shudder to think." "The winters are hard," Ned admitted, "but the Starks will endure. We always have." Yeah, the Starks will endure because they've got this big, nice castle that's built literally over a hot spring, and it stays fairly warm there, but not everybody in the North is as privileged as the Starks. So the Starks might endure, but what happens to the rest of the people in the North once winter comes? That is a question that I think not a lot of people in the world of Ice and Fire think about, especially in a Game of Thrones, because all of our point of view characters are people of privilege. Robert starts telling Ned about the South and how it's summer. He starts describing all of the fruits and the wines and the girls with their sweat-soaked dresses. He says everyone is fat and drunk and rich, because that's all Robert cares about. And George has yet another interesting description. Robert Baratheon had always been a man of huge appetites, a man who knew how to take his pleasures. That was not a charge anyone could lay at the door of Eddard Stark. So how does he have a bastard son? If Ned is not a character to take his pleasures, how did he get a woman pregnant who was not his wife? He didn't. We get descriptions of the crypts and how fucking creepy they are. By ancient custom, an iron longsword had been laid across the lap of each who had been Lord of Winterfell to keep the vengeful spirits in their crypts. The oldest had long ago rusted away to nothing, leaving only a few red stains where the metal had rested on stone. Ned wondered if that meant those ghosts were free to roam the castle now. He hoped not. I've always thought that line was really interesting. Like, why would the previous Lords of Winterfell be vengeful against their descendants? What would they have against them? Then again, the passage goes on to say, the first Lords of Winterfell had been men hard as the land they ruled. In the centuries before the Dragon Lords came over the sea, they had sworn allegiance to no man, styling themselves the kings in the north. So maybe they're vengeful because the Starks have bowed to the Targaryens? Or they're just vengeful because they're dead and the current characters are living. I don't know. The crypt continued on into the darkness ahead of them, but beyond this point the tombs were empty and unsealed. Black holes waiting for their dead, waiting for him and his children. Ned did not like to think on that. So that's a pretty creepy description, and obviously foreshadowing for the deaths of Ned and Catelyn and Robb, and possibly more Starks to come. We don't know yet. We get the first background information on Ned's long-past siblings, Brandon Stark and Lyanna Stark. Brandon had been 20 when he died, strangled by order of the Mad King, Aerys Targaryen, only a few short days before he was to wed Catelyn Tully of Riverrun. So we learned that the original plan actually wasn't for Ned to marry Catelyn. His older brother was betrothed to her, and then Ned took his place when he died. So that's pretty fucked up. Lyanna had only been 16, a child woman of surpassing loveliness. Ned had loved her with all his heart. Robert had loved her even more. She was to have been his bride. So we get more of Ned romanticizing Robert's love for Lyanna when it becomes pretty clear that Robert only loved Lyanna for her beauty rather than for who she was as a person. Robert starts to complain about Lyanna being buried in the crypts and how she deserved more than darkness. She was a Stark in Winterfell, Ned said quietly. This is her place. I was with her when she died, Ned reminded the king. She wanted to come home to rest beside Brandon and father. He could hear her still at times. "Promise me," she had cried in a room that smelled of blood and roses. "Promise me, Ned." The fever had taken her strength, and her voice had been faint as a whisper. But when he gave her his word, the fear had gone out of his sister's eyes. Ned remembered the way she had smiled then, how tightly her fingers had clutched his as she gave up her hold on life, the rose petals spilling from her palm dead and black. After that, he remembered nothing. So, the way that George wrote this, again, makes the reader think that the promise Lyanna had extracted from Ned before her death was that she wanted to be buried back at home at Winterfell alongside her dead brother and her dead father. But as soon as Ned gives Lyanna his word, it says the fear had gone out of his sister's eyes. So why would Lyanna be fearful about where she's buried? Like, she's about to die, she knows she's dying. Why is that something that's on her mind? That seems like a really weird thing for someone to be fearful about on their deathbed. So I forgot to continue my thought on this in the video, but I'm sure you guys knew where I was going with this. So Lyanna being fearful about where she was going to be buried, where would be her final resting place, as she's dying, doesn't really make sense. So what other promise could Lyanna be trying to extract from Ned? What is so important to her that she is clinging on to life, waiting for Ned to give her his word? Ned notes in this chapter that the room they were in smelled of blood and roses, and he says that a fever had taken Lyanna's strength. But we still don't know what she was dying from. Later on in the book, however, Ned remembers Lyanna's bed of blood. And of course, one of the only reasons a woman would be lying in a bed that's soaked with blood is because she's just given birth. And Lyanna making Ned promise that he's going to protect her child makes a whole lot more sense than her making him promise that she's going to be buried back at Winterfell. As they're talking about Lyanna's death, Robert then says, "I've had to kill Rhaegar for what he did to her." "You did," Ned reminded him. "Only once," Robert said bitterly. "In my dreams I kill him every night," Robert admitted. 1,000 deaths will still be less than what he deserves. There was nothing Ned could say to that. So, according to Robert, Rhaegar did something horrible to Lyanna that he wanted to kill him for. She was his betrothed, and obviously the story now is that Rhaegar kidnapped her and raped her. But in Dany's chapter, which is directly prior to this, it says, her brother Rhaegar battling the usurper, Robert, in the bloody waters of the Trident, and dying for the woman he loved. So according to Dany, Rhaegar was in love with Lyanna, and then Ned has nothing to say to Robert when he says that 1,000 deaths still wouldn't be what he deserved, like he deserves more than that. And Ned can't respond. So Ned obviously knows something here that he can't tell Robert, so he just stays quiet and holds his tongue. Ned says that they should be getting back, that Robert needs to return to his wife. Robert says, "The others take my wife." More foreshadowing or just a silly line. Cersei's gotta die somehow, and later on in her point of view, we get flashbacks of the prophecy of the Valonqar wrapping its fingers around her pale white throat. So if her throat is pale and white when she finally dies, I don't think it's that big of a stretch to theorize that she may become an other before she meets her final death. Ned and Robert start talking about Jon Arryn, who of course is the reason why Robert is there. They talk about Lysa Arryn, who's Catelyn's sister and Jon's widow. Robert mentions how losing Jon had driven Lysa mad, and how she ran off back to the Eyrie with their son, even though Robert had planned on fostering him with Tywin Lannister. Ned thinks that he would sooner entrust a child to a pit viper than Tywin Lannister. He offers to foster Jon Arryn's son with them at Winterfell because he's family, and he says that Lysa would be welcome to come as well because it's Catelyn's sister. But Robert says that because Tywin Lannister has already made the offer to foster Jon Arryn's son, that it would be a great insult. And Ned replies, "I am more concerned for my nephew's welfare than I do for Lannister pride," which I think is another interesting line because yes, Robert Arryn is Ned's nephew by marriage, but he's got another nephew by blood that he's basically put everything on the line in order to protect, and that's Jon Snow. They start talking about how Robert needs to visit the rest of the North. Ned says, "And there is the wall. You need to see it, your grace, to walk along its battlements and talk to those who man it. The Night's Watch is a shadow of what it once was." Benjen says, "No doubt I will hear what your brother says soon enough," Robert said. So Ned is trying to tell Robert about the state of the Night's Watch and how it's like just really failing. And Robert cuts him off because Robert's got more important business. So we're getting a better sense of what people in the Seventh Kingdom think about the Night's Watch and how it's basically just a problem that's brushed off. Like, Ned cares and he's trying to draw Robert's attention to the fact that the Night's Watch needs more funding and needs more men, but he also gets sidetracked. Like, this isn't brought up again. So this is one of those problems that just continually get swept under the rug. The wall is miles and miles away and no one really cares. So of course that's just a recipe for disaster. But then Robert finally cuts to the chase as to why he's actually in Winterfell, which Ned had already suspected. I want you at my side, Ned. I want you down in King's Landing, not up here at the end of the world where you are no damn use to anybody. So I think that's interesting how Robert calls Winterfell in the north the end of the world. Not yet, but it's going to be. Robert then starts complaining about what it's like to be king. I swear to you, sitting a throne is 1,000 times harder than winning one. They all want something, money or land or justice. I'm surrounded by flatterers and fools. It can drive a man to madness, Ned. Lord Eddard Stark, I would name you Hand of the King. Ned dropped to one knee. The offer did not surprise him. What other reason could Robert have for coming so far? Robert was offering him a responsibility as large as the realm itself. It was the last thing in the world he wanted. So even though Ned was prepared and he kind of already knew that this was what Robert was riding north for, he still really fucking hates it. Your Grace, he said, I'm not worthy of the honor. Robert groaned with good-humored impatience. If I wanted to honor you, I'd let you retire. I am planning to make you run the kingdom and fight the wars while I eat, drink, and wench myself into an early grave. So Robert obviously has no interest in being a good king. He has no interest in being king, period. He just wants to benefit from what his status provides and have Ned do everything for him. He threw his head back and roared his laughter. The echoes rang through the darkness, and all around them the dead of Winterfell seemed to watch with cold and disapproving eyes. So more foreshadowing that Ned going south is really not the right move to make. They banter a bit about how Ned never smiles. They say it grows so cold up here in winter that a man's laughter freezes in his throat and chokes him to death, Ned said evenly. Perhaps that is why the Starks have so little humor. Well, something's going to be choking them to death in winter. But it's probably not going to be laughter. Robert goes on to talk about how he and Ned were meant to rule together. If Lyanna had lived, we should have been brothers, bound by blood as well as affection. Well, it is not too late. I have a son, you have a daughter. My Joff and your Sansa shall join our houses, as Lyanna and I might have done. So along with Robert offering Ned position of Hand of the King, he's also proposing that his son Joffrey and Sansa marry in order to join houses Stark and Baratheon, because he and Lyanna were supposed to do that, but then she died. But because Joffrey isn't a real Baratheon, this line is really interesting. I have a son, you have a daughter. But Ned has 2 daughters, and Robert has a shit ton of kids that he doesn't even know about. And 2 of them meet up. It's really interesting to read these early chapters of A Game of Thrones because George did have that outline where he planned for Jon and Arya to fall in love with each other. But by the end of A Game of Thrones, it becomes clear that a lot of what George had written in that original outline got scrapped and changed. And in A Clash of Kings, when Arya meets up with Gendry, it becomes clear that those 2 have strong affection for each other and are possibly going to be a love interest for each other. So you have to wonder if George got to the end of writing A Game of Thrones, he knew that a lot of things from his original outline were going to end up getting scrapped, and if he went back and tweaked these first few chapters in order to reflect the changes that he had made. So I'm wondering if he added this line here, I have a son, you have a daughter, because he knew that he was going to have Gendry and Arya meet in the next book and have them be the Baratheon and Stark that would end up falling in love and getting married and joining their houses rather than, you know, the imposter Baratheon Joffrey, because he's not really a Baratheon. So it's really interesting. I remember when I was first watching the show, Arya and Gendry were one of my favorite dynamics, and then when I read the book, I just loved their pairing even more. I really hope that that line is foreshadowing, because I think it would be a nice symmetry in the series to have 2 characters who kind of embody who Lyanna Stark was. You've got one, Jon Snow, who is her son, and then you've got Arya, who is constantly compared to Lyanna throughout the entire series. If these 2 parts of Lyanna ended up with her 2 suitors from when she was a girl. So Arya would end up with a Baratheon, and Jon would end up with a Targaryen. I think that would just make things come full circle, but who knows? After Robert proposes that Joffrey and Sansa marry, Ned says that he needs to tell Catelyn first. Yes, yes, of course, tell Catelyn, sleep on it if you must. The king reached down, clasped Ned by the hand, and pulled him roughly to his feet. Just don't keep me waiting too long. I am not the most patient of men. For a moment, Eddard Stark was filled with a terrible sense of foreboding. This was his place, here in the north. He looked at the stone figures all around them, breathed deep in the chill silence of the crypt. He could feel the eyes of the dead. They were all listening, he knew, and winter was coming. It's really interesting that this chapter ends with Ned looking around the crypt and thinking, this is his place. He really means Winterfell, but the crypt is actually Ned's place because he's gonna die. In Catelyn's first chapter, she's thinking about all of these signs and symbolism and the stag and the direwolf and, the disappearances beyond the wall. She is thinking about all of this stuff, and Ned's kind of just, brushing it off and poo-pooing it like, you're overthinking things. But now, Ned finally feels it. He feels that sense of foreboding, and he's right to feel it, but he doesn't do anything about it. So lesson here is listen to your instincts, because Ned didn't, and he got his head chopped off. Those are my thoughts on Eddard I of the Game of Thrones. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments down below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!